Hello again, and thanks for tuning in to part 4 of the Human Readable podcast. This is where I, Cory Doctorow, am reading the novella Human Readable as originally published in the Future Washington anthology aloud through a series of podcasts. It's been a good week. I'm sorry I didn't get another installment out during the week. It's just been very crazy. I was in Geneva for a couple of days. That was very fun. I was at the LIFT conference. Really good, and I got to see a lot of people there. Thank you for everyone who came up and said hello, and it was great to see Bruce Sterling and just the whole gang again. I had a lot of fun. I'm not a big fan of Geneva, mostly because I spent all the time that I've spent there, I spent at the UN, at the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is to dumb copyright what Mordor is to evil, and it's just kind of depressing hanging out there. So I have lots of bad associations with Geneva, but I did have a great time at the conference, thanks to everyone and to the conference organizers especially. Some other good stuff happened this week. I've signed contracts to produce pieces for The Economist and Print Magazine, which is pretty funny, a different kind of venue for me to be writing in. I'm getting ready for a trip next week from the 12th to the 20th. I'm going to be in Boston, Mass. I wish I had more time there, but mostly I'm just going to be doing all kinds of speaking gigs and private consultations and a little teaching at MIT and a couple of readings, and I'm going to be a guest at BosCon, the Boston Science Fiction Convention. I'm already kind of maxed out. I know that there are a bunch of people there who are friends of mine and who I'd like to be seeing in Boston. If you're listening to this, my apologies. I'm out of lunches, dinners, and coffee breaks. I'm just maxed out, so sorry if I haven't gotten in touch with you. The other cool thing that's happening is I'm doing some stuff with a fine art gallery here in London. I'll have more information on that shortly, I hope. So that's it. That's the news for the week, and thank you all for tuning in again. And without further ado, here is Human Readable Part 4. The Krulls were alive the next morning, exuberantly tracking across the walls and over the mirror and down the stairs. They picked out the important ones and trailed them to convenient spots with a fingertip and devoured them, reading interesting bits aloud to one another. Soon the Krulls had been tamed and only a few personal messages remained. Trish dragged hers over to the tabletop next to her cereal bowl and opened them up while she ate. Outside she could hear the whisper of cars speeding down the road, and she supposed with a mingling of regret and relief that she should probably go into her office. She opened her personal mail. It had been 3 days since she'd read it, but for all that, a surprisingly small amount had accumulated. Of course, everyone else had been without connectivity, too. This was mostly stuff from the East Coast and Europe, people who'd been awake for a couple hours. She read, filed, and forwarded, tapping out the occasional one-word answer to simple questions or bouncing back messages with a form letter. Then she came to the note from the Coast Guard medic. He didn't mince words. It was in the first sentence. The surfer dude she'd rescued had had a second cardiac arrest on the boat. They'd tried what they could, but he hadn't recovered. He was a freak statistic of the downtime, another person who'd lost his life when the ants spazzed out. They'd recovered his board and found its black box. The accelerometer and GPS recorded the spill he'd taken after the loss of climate and wave condition data from the other surfers strung out on the coast. He'd stayed up for about 10 seconds before going under. She stared numbly at the note, the spoon halfway to her mouth. And then she dropped the spoon into the bowl, not noticing that it splashed milk down her blouse. She got up from the table and went into the kitchen. Raynor was there in a change of clothes he'd bought from a mom-and-pop Gap at the mall on the corner that had been taking IOUs from anyone who could show a driver's license with a local address. She grabbed his wrist, making him slosh Starbucks down his front. She took the cup out of his hands and set it down on the counter, then put her arms around his chest and hugged him. He didn't protest or ask any questions. He just put his arms around her and hugged back. Eventually she cried. Then she told him what she was crying about. She let him tell her that she was a hero, that she'd saved Jory's life and almost saved the surfer's life, and she let him tell her that it wasn't her fault for sloshing into the ocean to rinse off the barf, and she let him tell her that he loved her, and she cried until she thought she was cried out, and then she started again. He took her upstairs and lay her down on the bed. He undressed her, and she let him. He put her in fluffy jammies, and she let him. He wiped away her makeup and her hot tears with a cool face cloth, and she let him. He took her hand and ran his fingers over her fingernails, squeezing each one a little, the way she liked, and she let him. You're going to have a nice lie down for a couple hours, and I'm going to be right beside you. I'll call the department secretary and tell him that you're taking a personal day and will be in tomorrow. Then we're going to go see Jory and his family, so that you can see the boy whose life you saved. And then we are going to go for a walk in the hills, and then I'm going to put you to bed. When you get up in the morning, you can make an appointment to see a grief counselor, or not. But today I'm in charge, all right?" Her heart swelled with love, and she felt a tear slip down her cheek. "Raynor," she said, "you're a wonder." "You inspire me, darling," he said, and kissed her eyelids shut. Their 35th date was their last. "You're going to Washington," he said, when he saw the boxes in her office. "Yes," she said. He stood in the doorway of her office. Trish was painfully aware of the other faculty members in the corridor watching him. Their romance was no secret, of course. Everyone in the law department knew about him. All the network engineers knew about her, and they both took substantial amount of ribbing about mixed marriages and interfaith dating. Trish realized with a pang that it was likely that everyone in the law department knew that she decided to go back to the Hill, but that he'd only suspected it until this instant. "Well, good for you," he said, putting on a brave face that was belied by the fret wrinkles in his forehead. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have told you once I decided, but I didn't want to do it over the phone." "I'm glad you didn't," he said, holding up his hand. "Do you want to come out for dinner with me anyway?" She gestured at the half-packed office. "The movers are coming in the morning." "Well then, do you suppose you could use some help? I could get some Burger King or Taco Bell." She looked at him for a long moment, swallowing the knob in her throat. "That would be lovely. Mexican, I mean. Taco Bell," she said. "Thank you." He let her pay for it. "You're making the big bucks now," he said, and he was a surprisingly conscientious packer, patting her framed pictures carefully, and wrapping her knickknacks in individual sheets of spun fiber. "Well then," he said, once he'd finished writing out a description of his latest box's contents on its outside, "you always told me that hill rats were hill rats for life, I suppose." "Yeah," she said. She knew she should explain, but they'd had the argument about it 3 times since the new PAC had contacted her and offered her the executive director position. The explanation wouldn't get any better now that she'd made up her mind. The new PAC, the Association for a Human Readable World, was the brainchild of some people she'd worked with while she was on the Hill. They'd asked her to hire a team, to scout an office, and then to camp out in the offices of various important committee chairmen until they passed a law limiting the scope of emergent network meshes. The Europeans had enacted legislation requiring cops, hydroelectric agencies, banks, hospitals, and aviation authorities to use interrogatable networks within 10 days of the downtime. With 15,000 dead in Western Europe alone, with Florence in flames and Amsterdam under 2 meters of water, it was an easy call. The U.S. had scoffed at them and pointed to the economic efficiencies of a self-governing network, but the people who were funding Human Readable World wanted to know where the old concepts like transparency and accountability and consent of the governed fit in when the world's essential infrastructure was being managed by non-sentient ant colony simulations. "Be gentle with us, okay?" he said. "Oh, I wish I had your confidence in my ability," she said, sucking down her big gulp of Coke. He put down his food and looked hard at her. He looked longer than was polite, even for ex-lovers, and she began to squirm. "What?" she said. "You're not putting me on." "Amazing. Patricia Lourdes McCavity, you have felled an empire, and you are setting yourself up to fell another, and it's one that I'm pretty heavily invested in, both professionally and financially." "Come on," she said. "I'm good, but I'm not a superwoman. I was part of a team." "I've read your briefs, position papers, opinions, speeches, hell, your press releases. They were the most cogent, convincing explanations for intellectual property reform I'd ever read. You weren't the judge, but you were his clerk. You weren't the committee chairman, but you were her head staffer. Taco Bell underestimated you. Coke underestimated you. Starbucks underestimated you. Disney underestimated you. Vivendi and Sony underestimated you. Now you're running your own organization, and it's pointed at me, and I am scared shitless, you want to know the truth. I'm not underestimating you." He drew his dark eyebrows together while he spoke, lowered his head, so that he was looking up at her from under his brow, looking intense as the day they'd met, when he was delivering a brilliant lecture on ant colony optimization to a large lay audience at the law school, fielding the Q&A with such convulsive humor and scalding lucidity that he'd melted her heart. She felt herself blushing, then wondered if she was flushing. She still loved him and still craved the feeling of his skin on hers, wanted nothing more than another lost weekend with him, taking turns being the strong one and the one who surrendered, soothing each other and spoiling each other. Thinking of that first meeting brought back all those feelings with keen intensity that made her breasts ache and her hands flutter on the box she was eating off of. "Raynor," she began, then stopped. She took a couple of deep breaths. "I'm not gunning for you, you know. You and I want the same thing, a world that we can be proud to live in. Your family's company has contributed more to the public good than any of us can really appreciate." He blushed now, too. She never talked about his father's role in the earliest build-outs of ant-based emergent routing algorithms, about the family fortune that he'd amassed through the company that still bore his name, 30 years after he'd stepped down as chairman of the board. Raynor was a genius in his own right, she knew, and his contributions to the field were as important as his father's, but he was haunted by the idea that his esteem in the field was due more to his surname than his research. He waved his hands at her, and she waved hers back. "Shush! I'm trying to explain something to you. Between your father and you, the world has increased its capacity and improved its quality of life by an order of magnitude. You've beaten back Malthus for at least another century. That makes you heroes. But your field has been co-opted by corrupt interests. When you study the distributions, you can see it clearly. The rich and powerful get to their destinations more quickly. The poor are routed through franchise ghettos and onto toll roads. The more important you are, the fewer number of connections you have to make when you fly, the better the chance that you'll get a kidney when you need it. The evidence is there for anyone to see, if only you look. We need standards for this. We need to be able to interrogate the system and find out why it does what it does. That's an achievable goal, and a modest one. We're just asking for the same checks and balances we rely on in the real world." He looked away and set down his taco. "Trish, I have a lot of respect for you. Please remember this when I tell you this. You are talking nonsense. The network is, by definition, above corruption. You simply can't direct it to give your cronies a better deal than the rest of the world. The system is too complex to game. Its behavior can't be predicted. How could it possibly be guided? Statistics can be manipulated to prove anything, but everyone who has any clue about this understands that this is just paranoid raving." She narrowed her eyes and sucked in a breath, and he clamped his lips shut, breathing heavily through his nose, and went on. "Sorry, it's just wrong, is all. Science isn't like law. You deal with shades of gray all the time. You make compromises, seek out balance. I'm talking about mathematical truths here, not human-created political constructs. There's no one to compromise with. A human-readable emergent network just doesn't exist. It can't exist. It doesn't make sense to say it. It's like asking me to make pi equal to 3. Pi means something, and what it means isn't 3. Emergent networks mean not human-readable." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and they looked at each other. She felt a sad smile in the corners of her lips, and saw one tug at his, and then they both broke out in grins. "We're going to be seeing a lot of each other," she said. "Oh, yes, we are," he said. "Across a committee room? A podium? On talk shows? Opposite sides. Right. No fighting dirty, okay," he said, raising his eyebrows and showing her his big brown eyes. She snorted. "Give me a hug and go home," she said. "I'll see you at the hearings when they introduce my bill." He hugged her, and she smelled him, thinking, "This is the last time I'll smell this smell." "Raynor," she said, holding him out at arm's length. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to call you when I have questions about ant colony optimization, all right?" He looked at her. "I need the best expertise I can get. It's in your interest to see to it that I'm well informed." Slowly he nodded. "Yes, you're right. I'd like that. I'll call you when I have questions about policy, all right?" "You're on," she said, and they hugged again, fiercely. Once he was gone, she permitted herself the briefest of tears. She knew that she was right, and that she was going to make a fool out of him, and she didn't want to think of that right then. She felt the place behind her ear where he'd kissed her before going home, and looked around her office, 5 years of her life in 30 bankers' boxes, ready to be shipped across the country tomorrow, according to a route that would be governed from moment to moment by invisible, notional, ridiculous insects.
She ate more Taco Bell. The logo was a pretty one, really, and now that it had been adopted by every mom-and-pop burrito joint in the world, they'd really leveled the playing field. She thought about the old Taco Bell mystery meat and plastic cheese and took a bite from the ground beef and sharp Monterey Jack that had come from her favorite little place on the corner, and permitted herself to believe, for a second, that she'd make that possible. She was going to kick ass on the hill. 3. Conflict of insect. Trish gathered her staff in the boardroom and wrote the following in glowing letters on the wall with her fingertip, leaving the text in her expressive schoolmarm's handwriting rather than converting it to some sterile font. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Her staff, all 5 of them, chuckled softly. Recognize it? She asked, looking round at them. Pee Wee Herman, said the grassroots guy, who was so young it ached to look at him, but who could fire a cannon-load of email into any congressional office on 12 hours' notice. He never stopped joking. The lawyer cocked an eyebrow at him and stroked her mustache, a distinctive gesture that you could see in any number of court TV archives of famous civil rights battles, typically just before she unloaded from both barrels at the jury box and set one or another of her many precedents. It's Martin Luther King, right? Close, Trish said. Geronimo? Guessed the paralegal, who probably wasn't going to work out after all, being something of a giant flake who spent more time on the phone to her girlfriend than filing papers and looking up precedents. Nope, Trish said, looking at the other 2 staffers, the office manager and the media guy, who shrugged and shook their heads. It's Gandhi, she said. They all went, oh, except the grassroots guy, who crossed to the wall and used his fingertip to add, and then they assassinate you. I'm too tough to die, the lawyer said, and you're all too young, so I think we're safe. Okay, Trish said. This is an official pep talk. They're playing dirty now. Last night my car tried to take me to Arlington via Detroit. My email is arriving on a 72-hour time delay. My phone doesn't ring, or it rings all night long. I've had to switch it off. But what all this means is that I've got more uninterrupted work time than ever, and I'm getting reacquainted with my bicycle. Every number I ring calls my ex-girlfriend's place, the grassroots guy said. I think we're going to get back together. That's the right attitude, boyo, the lawyer said. When life gives you SARS, make sarsaparilla. I appear to be unable to access any of my personal files, and any case law I query shows up 1 sentence at a time. I've discovered, though, that the Georgetown University Law Library makes a very nice latte and serves a terrific high tea, and I've set Giselle to work refiling and cross-indexing 20 years' worth of yellow pads that had previously sat mouldering in a storage locker that I was paying far too much for. Which has given Giselle a rare opportunity to explore the rich civil rights history that you embody, Trish said, looking pointedly at the paralegal. But I suspect that she could use a hand, possibly from a grad student or 2 who could get some credit for this. Let's ask around at Georgetown, okay? The lawyer nodded. The office manager pointed out that their bill payments were going astray after they'd been dispatched to their suppliers, but before they were debited from their dwindling account, which meant that they were getting a couple days' worth of free cash flow. Only the media guy was glum, since he couldn't field, make or review calls or press releases, which made him pretty useless indeed. Right, Trish said, and scribbled something onto one of the steno pads she'd bought for everyone when their emails started going down 3 times a day. This guy owes me from back in the copyright wars. I fed him some good stories that he used to launch his career. He was AB/NBC Washington bureau chief until last year, and now he's teaching J-School at Columbia. Take the afternoon train to Manhattan and bring him back with you tonight. Don't take no for an answer. Tell him to bring his 3 most promising protégés, and tell him that they'll have all the access they need to produce an entire series on the campaign, sleeping on our sofas, following us to the toilet. Doable? It's doable, the media guy said. I'm on it. Once they'd all cleared out, the lawyer knocked on her door. You going to be all right? She asked. Trish waved her hands at the piles of briefing books, red-lined hard copies, marked-up magazine articles, and memos from her board of directors. Of course, she said. She shook her head. Probably. We never thought we'd get this far, remember? All the psyop shit they're pulling. It's just more proof that we're on the right track. No one should be able to do this. It's the opposite of democracy. It's the opposite of civil discourse. The lawyer smoothed her mustache. Right on, she said. You should be proud. This is a hell of a fight, and I'm glad to be part of it. You know we'd follow you into the sun, right? Trish fluttered her hands. God, don't give me that kind of responsibility. All right, then. Into the ocean. We're making that happen is what's important. Thanks, babe, Trish said. She put on a brave smile until the lawyer had backed out of the office, and then stared down at her calendar and looked at her morning schedule. 3 congressional staffers, a committee co-chair, an ACLU researcher, and the head of the newly formed Emergent Network Suppliers Industry Association, a man she had last seen in her office at UCLA, backing away from a long and melancholy hug.